This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joel Filiol, coach of JFT Crew, the multinational triathlon squad, and Olympic performance director with the Italian Triathlon Federation. We'll call this Season 3. I had thought about restarting in the start of the lockdown period in April, May, but thought better of giving that period some time and to come through focused on other things, family, general health, and the whole situation with the uncertainty about competitions and normal work with my coaching. So now that we're in pretty much the off season, I thought it's a good opportunity to start thinking about planning, sharing some information, put my thoughts in order as far as how proceeding, and so we'll see if we can have a solid Season 3 here before the new path to Tokyo 2021 starts again. As part of this process, I've used some of this period to put together some of the presentations I've done in the past into some form. We've got several eBooks on my website, joelfiliol.com/shop. There are a number of projects that I've done. Building the Elite Triathlete is an ebook that includes some of the programs that we use, the schedules, the high-level principles, how champions train, thinking again about the characteristics that some of the best athletes I've worked with possess, what the gold medal profile is, the demands of top-level triathlon, what the daily training environment is. So that's another ebook. And in combination with that, the characteristics of the high-level athlete. Some overlap, but behaviors, motivation, talking about commitment and high-level characteristics that we've seen across my experience. So there's 3 ebooks in combination, and then there's one specifically about the characteristics of effective coaching. You can also take that in a webinar format with a video and slides from a presentation. So we're talking about primarily about the soft skills and personal traits beyond just the technical skills. So these are what I think makes the difference between effective coaching and merely being good or being present. There's also a video presentation from going way back from 2008, post-Olympics, reflections on the process building up to Simon Whitfield's second Olympic medal, silver in Beijing, and Simon is also in that video, so you can watch that presentation and the slides or just the audio file. So all of that is available on my website if you want to have a look and give me some feedback on what you see there. And there's certainly other topics in the pipeline based on presentations I've done in the past that I plan to update, including more about how the squad has worked, the basis for some of the success we've had, specifics about altitude, about environment, environmental considerations, and more. So I've got a few more in the pipeline. So if you want to check that out, then give me some feedback, please do. We can start with sort of an analysis. It's a good point to look back at the 2020 season as it was. And obviously it was very different, the global situation, but specifically about thinking about triathlon. And we can start with the postponement of the 2020 Tokyo Games. And this takes us way back to March. We were getting ready to fly to Abu Dhabi for the first World Series, and we saw that the cycling tour that was planned to be the week before the World Series had been stopped, and indeed a number of the teams had been stuck there in the hotels on Yas Island. And of course eventually the World Series was cancelled, and it wasn't too long after that we received word that the Tokyo Games would be postponed. And of course at that point, with the uncertainty around whether we would be able to restart the 2020 season, at that point they had postponed, the ITU had postponed the start at least until the end of April, beginning of May. And at that time it looked clear that the Tokyo Games would have to be postponed. And of course the impact on the athletes was significant, and all the staff and coaches, myself for certain. When you're on a track for many years, building up towards something, and in my case it's over multiple games, and certainly for the athletes who are at near the apex of their careers, certainly a significant change in their process, and it was quite difficult. I think everyone handled all of that differently, but for those that really focusing on the peak of their career, it just changed the whole process of the way how they've gone about things, their day-to-day, their mission. And of course sport, and it goes without saying that sport in the context of the global health crisis, it pales in comparison in terms of importance, but on a personal level is a very big change. And it took quite a lot of time to adjust to and adapt to. And we saw the initial reaction. Some of the athletes enjoyed kind of the indoor training or the Zwift racing, that kind of stuff as as an alternative challenge, or we saw a lot of epic rides, epic training. That was the strategy certainly of some athletes, but in general, and we speak now with the benefit of hindsight and having gone through the season, as it were, but it was a big shock, and a lot of athletes thinking the end of the Olympic cycle is also a time of reflection and change, and that whole process also having to be on pause, very, very challenging for different athletes to deal with. Eventually, we had the postponement extended till the end of June, and then finally we could see then that there would be a chance of some competitions to restart, and while the travel for many athletes is unknown, if you're coming from the US or other countries, it wasn't clear whether they'd be able to travel, and then finally we had Hamburg on the schedule, Hamburg World Series, and at first we expected there might be some other World Series, but in the end there was just the one. And a little bit before the race, they announced that it would also be the World Championships, and that was also a surprise. It didn't give a lot of time to prepare specifically, because at that point we didn't know what the course might be like, because although it was in Hamburg, it wasn't in the usual city center course, and it's really a challenge of adaptability. On one hand, it didn't change too much. On the other hand, some athletes might have taken quite a different approach if it had been the World Championships. If it had been clear, it would have been the World Championships from farther out. In particular, in terms of a motivational and goal approach, it was quite a difference, and depending where the athletes are in their career and their focus, we could have had a different approach, but nonetheless happy to have the opportunity to race, and in the whole context, obviously for organizers, for organizations, very difficult to figure out the right way to be able to host events under what conditions. And as obviously we've seen these conditions constantly changing, constant new regulations, new rules, and make it very challenging. So in the end, for the ITU, or I should say the World Triathlon and the rebrand for them, we ended up with 4 primary races, Hamburg being the World Series, the only World Series, and then the World Championships plus the relay, and then Karlovy Vary, the World Cup, Arzachena, the World Cup in Sardinia, and finally just last weekend Valencia World Cup in Spain, and that was the series. And I think different athletes handled it differently. As I said, with the Tokyo side, it depends where you are in your career. The athletes, again, near the apex of their career would who were focused on Tokyo, focused on the World Championships. That was quite different. I think everyone handled that differently. On the other hand, younger athletes on the way up could probably see it in the sense that their process wasn't quite as refined. Their mission and where they are in their career was a bit different, and they could handle that differently. So we saw some athletes under a lot of stress, some a bit more free to perform, and indeed some athletes who weren't able to compete at all. For certainly the timing for the athletes in Australia and New Zealand much more difficult, and we didn't see them able to travel over to Europe to compete, and then a lot of question marks for others. So in general, it was a period, and when I reflect on those who had kind of a refined process, year to year, changing small things, but dialed in, if you like, that's been quite different than the athletes who haven't quite got there in their career, and you could describe it as sort of an anti-process year where it wasn't all about the process and those refinements and what the athletes know about how to perform, because this situation has been unprecedented. So it throws in sort of a randomness. It throws in different factors than normal, and I think that's one of the characteristics of this year. We've probably seen it as more in other sports, and I look at the change in cycling, for example. Cycling, we've seen a lot of new winners. It's been described to some degree as the emergence of youth or younger champions, and certainly it can be the case that riders that haven't got the chance, athletes that haven't got the chance to be the primary focus before, or they hit the timing right, could take that opportunity, and sometimes it's just a matter of having the opportunity to compete with the top goals that they might not have otherwise had, and that can be a game changer for the future. It only takes one moment of successful outcomes that can change the psychology of an athlete, that can have knock-on effects in the future. So we will see whether the youth winners continue to be successful from the cycling point of view. But I think certainly I reflect that different kind of process, that anti-process of the athletes who had the tour dialed in, for example, and the build up to that, the number of races, the chronic training load that gets built up over time. That process has been entirely different, and that's been the same in triathlon. I think the ones that have been able to be the most successful were able to preserve the key elements that has led to their success in the past. So what that can be, what is their daily environment like? What are their training partners like? Facilities, access, how different has that been to normal? Even the long training period. Typically, our season would start in December. We would build up to March, April, May racing, and perhaps some have some retraining period. And not having been able to do that, it has gone a long training period, and from December to September without racing, and that's quite different. It's one of those situations where more training isn't necessarily better. There's impacts of these super long training periods that need to be considered, and it's different than the process that we've been used to in the past. And I suspect a lot of athletes dealing with that. What changes do you need to make to your program if you're not able to race for a season or several months, and you can't simply train continually all that time? There's other considerations, and those have all been very different and needing consideration for this year, and how much of that remains in the future, we will see. I don't expect all in the future that we'll have this uncertainty, but it's also not going to end very soon. So it presents a challenge for coaches, for athletes to deal with uncertainty. To how do you change your process? What parts of the process do you need to keep? What part of and where do you need to be able to be flexible? So those are all considerations that have gone into this year. And again, I think the athletes who've been able to keep the main parts of their preparation, if they've been training at home primarily, and that was their normal environment, then perhaps less change, or if they've had less access to facilities, certainly in some countries. They'd not been able to swim for several months, from March, April to June, July, some of them, and that's had an impact. But also, for environments like the way that I've worked, some athletes could join in a group environment, and others couldn't, and then there's also the impact of daily FaceTime, daily opportunity to make changes, to be present coaching. Those can be the difference makers. And though we can be adaptable, and we have to be adaptable, at the same time, those can make a big difference to performance. So some analysis of where we've been this year, and I've got a number of questions that have built up over time, and at the conclusion of this, I'd like to get some new, fresh questions based on context, based on what I've been talking about here, and that'll be, you can send that to podcast@joelfilio.com by email. Less on social these days, so that's the best way to send feedback for future topics and for season 3 of the Real Coaching Podcast. So I'll start with the first couple of questions, and they're from Andrew and Crawford, some Scottish coaches here where I'm based. And the first is, under the current COVID situation with racing, immune response, and how have you adapted your training for your athletes? And as I alluded to before, that's changed, that's evolved. I think with the benefit of hindsight, where if we might have known how long we were going to have off, might have done some things differently. Perhaps would have taken a bit of an off season when we first went into lockdown, a bit more of an off period. But I think we've had to manage the training load, and in terms of if you don't know when the competitions are going to start, or you have to manage particularly the high intensity training. And that's of course a big theme with how I think about training, how I talk about training, is how much intensity you use, when you incorporate more specific high intensity training into the program, and how long those periods are. And so those are all factors that we've had to consider. And also I think the overall stress of the situation, I think at the beginning in particular of this period, but equally going forward, the situation is more stressful than normal. More general life stress in terms of uncertainty, of change of routine, all kinds of aspects of the background of an athlete's ability to adapt. And so I think having a slightly more modest training load is appropriate for this period, where we don't want to be kind of near the limits as much in terms of recovery, in terms of the energy cost. Outside stress is a significant factor, and I think that applies for every athlete situation. So we need to build in a buffer for that, and manage the high intensity, the specific intensity side. Certainly saw some athletes involved in quite high intensity specific training when races were months away, and merely because it was the summer period, the European summer, even though races could be 3 or 4 months away, then still going according to the time of year, not necessarily according to the reality. And again, my view is that that kind of high intensity training is not sustainable, and therefore we have to carefully consider in the current context how we adapt according to the reality, according to what are the opportunities. And so thinking about the training load is the first part, and the second part of that is how we manage without competitions. And I think there's a value to following a training process, even if you don't have the outcome of a competition. And again, the point I would see of how we improve over time is by following that process. It's by building up that chronic load, getting the adaptations, the improvements from the training process. Whether or not we have a competition as the culmination is not the most important factor. So I think moving forward as well, we can consider that the same approach. There's value in following a process. There's value in building another training cycle on top of the historical training built up for the athletes, even if we don't have big competitions. And not as much a supporter for most athletes of needing to create artificial competitions or training challenges. I think it's not for everyone that, because I think some athletes are just not motivated in the same way, and we don't want to change and get too far away from the fundamentals of training. However, there are some athletes that need some kind of external motivator, and in those cases we can consider time trials or some kind of training challenge, and they may benefit from that. But I think we need to keep our focus, as we always say, on the process, on connecting to the training process, to what it takes to build up to our best condition for the athlete, and in using that time to continue to progress. The effect of year-on-year training, of that multi-year chronic training load build up, we can still follow that process. And so I think there's some value there. But in general, it's adapting according to overall stress, according to the intensity and how we manage high intensity specific training, and taking those into account, that we're not just following the usual program based on new dates and new realities, but also that we are able to maintain contact with the big picture of continuing to improve. Next question is, how are you finding being more of a remote coach? Any tips, learnings you found work best with a squad with different needs? And certainly we saw at the beginning an explosion of Zoom training and different groups using, for example, all doing indoor cycling training connected on Zoom and that kind of stuff. That wasn't something that I felt we needed to do at the time. I think we've all kind of struggled to find what's the right reaction to the change in process, and as I said, with kind of on the personal side, I think we needed some time to absorb the situation and not necessarily rush to fill gaps. But certainly it helps. The stronger your relationships are with the athletes you're working with as a coach, the more effective you'll be able to be a remote coach. And certainly some, of course, in general, being in communication, having a way to manage and monitor training remotely, whether that's some online system or others, is very important. Continuing to be engaged with the training that's being done, and of course the critical thing is paying attention to when changes are needed. And that's that fundamental part of coaching, is paying attention, observing. Even if you can't observe directly, you can look at the words written, you can understand tone, you can do video or audio. Certainly we've had more and more opportunity to remain in contact, and that's fundamental. We need to be reactive to when we need to make changes. We don't want to just have the athlete plow on ahead with a program that may not be appropriate for one or more reasons, that might cause problems. And the mistakes we're likely to make in coaching are simply training load mistakes that lead to injury or health problems. So we need to pay attention. We need to be engaged. We need the athlete to be engaged in communication and to be reactive. So I think those things are the same principles as being face-to-face. And of course, it can never be as effective as face-to-face coaching. And of course, part of coaching in the daily environment is also the interaction with other athletes and the number of contact points. And of course, that's not the same. And I think in order to manage that, we have to, again, have the training load not near the limits of what the athletes can do. We need to build in a buffer in the training load so that if something goes wrong, if we make an error in recovery according to what they can manage, then we're not so close to the athlete's limits that we're likely to end up with a problem. And so typically for athletes that are remote, they end up doing a little bit less training load to build in that room for error, if you like. So that's one of the things. So I think it's engagement, it's communication, and managing the training a little differently to avoid problems. Next question. How has your planning changed, long-term and short-term? I touched on some of these points in the sense that keeping your eye on the long-term in this period, I think, is important. Every athlete handled the situation differently. Some highly motivated to continue their process, some taking advantage of the break or change of routine. And so I think, as always, keeping big picture in mind with planning. How can we get back on track after, for some athletes, a season or a year without racing? And we know that we've had that experience with athletes that have had injuries in the past. So where they haven't been able to race for a long period of time, and we know that they've been able to come back to that, come back to racing from those periods and been able to be successful. So from that point of view, we can be confident that even with a break from racing, they'll be able to come back and achieve high-level performances. Some athletes that got a bit far away from their process might struggle to readapt to their routine, their habits, their daily process, and those athletes, that'll be the challenge for those athletes, is reconnecting with that if they've been away from it from a little bit. But I think if we're motivated for achieving goals, if we're focused on what we want to achieve and we reconnect what do we have to do to get there, then I think that we can do that. So I think it's been necessary to be slightly more flexible in the short term, while keeping the sense of what do we need to do in the long term to continue to progress, what things today will connect to the long term, while being adaptable in the short term. The next questions are a little bit older. I received these a while ago, but still useful, I think, to touch on. And the first is, what studies did I do? How did I get into coaching? And just recently, I did a talk with Barry Shepley and his organization in Ontario, Personal Best, put on a online clinic, and where I touched some of this. But you can also go back to episode 1 of this podcast, the Real Coaching Podcast, where I talk a little bit about my history. But very briefly, I was a junior athlete in Canada. I raced the Kids of Steel series, did my first triathlon when I was 12, and eventually that progressed into coaching, and I had the opportunity to move out to Victoria, British Columbia, after Simon Whitfield had won gold in Sydney. And that progressed step by step with different opportunities. So I grew into coaching via being to some degree in the right place at the right time, and others, of course, taking advantage of those opportunities and making my own luck by following the path. What studies did I do? I started my university degree in kinesiology at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, but I didn't finish because I had the opportunity to move out to British Columbia to start as a mentor coach or an apprentice coach, and work with the team around Simon at the time. So I didn't finish my degree, and I eventually did some other coaching levels, including the National Coaching Institute Level 4 program connected to the University of Victoria, but I did not go back and finish my degrees. So I've learned triathlon from the School of Experience from those years, and although I've always been keenly interested in the science side, and that's again where I started my studies, and so I bring kind of that perspective to my coaching. But it is really the school of practical experience, and though you couldn't exactly follow my path, I suppose what I could say to any coach thinking, how do I get into my ITU career? It's spending time in a daily environment where you can interact with athletes and observe coaches coaching. It's invaluable and necessary to grow experience. I think when I first moved to Victoria, although I had actually been doing some online coaching and personal coaching in a group environment was entirely different, and certainly those experiences of having a squad on deck in the water, how do you communicate with them, how do you pay attention, what do you pay attention to, working with other coaches, all invaluable. So advice for coaches at looking to get into the Olympic pathway coaching is to find a way to spend time with athletes face to face, and particularly in the context now, it's not the easiest, but you have to find a way to get that kind of experience. and to open your eyes to what squad coaching is, what face-to-face coaching is, particularly in the era where a lot of athletes might have, a lot of coaches might have experience, or it's easy to start an online business, but it's not easy to start and grow experience face-to-face with athletes in that kind of environment. And so find a way to make that happen. As I said, I was fortunate enough to be in the right place to take advantage of those opportunities, and that's where I think you need to go if you want a career in coaching. Next question, tips for athletes who aren't durable on the run or can't handle mileage. And the first part is really that there's not one run mileage that you need to do, that an athlete needs to do. There's a wide range of mileage that athletes have been able to be very successful doing. And certainly the principle that more isn't better, and being healthy and able to be consistent with running is a number one factor for achieving running performance. And the corollary is the greatest problem that athletes have with running performance is when they have injuries, and then they miss long blocks of running as a result, and they get all of the detraining effects that come from not being able to run for a period of time, and thus having to restart again and hopefully be patient, but often not, and end up with future problems. The best predictor of future injuries, of course, in running is the past running experiences, the past running injuries that they've had. And so try to avoid them in the first place, but certainly that's critical. So aren't durable, the first part is not believing that you need to run a certain amount. And the right amount is what you can do consistently, what you can repeat. And so being careful with peak loads, we can start with the volume of intensity. I think that's the part that we can do less of. Just because you're doing 10K off the bike, if you're doing standard distance, doesn't mean you need to do 10K of hard work every session. I mean, it may be obvious, but still, that's a lot of what I see. So we can do less volume of intensity as a principle. The intensity is where we're going to have most of the problems. We're not usually going to see as many problems just from basic running frequency if we're running easy enough. So that's the other point, is make sure easy runs are really easy. Again, athletes that can measure everything, we just see often they're running their easy runs too fast. And that's like the first step. Would always consider breaking up the frequency. Have a day or two off of running, and then in eventually a more advanced strategy is, rather for athletes who aren't durable, rather than do a very long run, for example, or do longer duration runs, to split into 2 runs, or rather than run a 90-minute long run, they could do an hour 5, and then do a shorter run later in the day, or vice versa, short run in the morning and longer run later in the day. Both are strategies that I've used. So you can split longer runs if necessary, and for others, if durability is really an issue, that even that is a risk, then do the minimum that they can do to continue to be healthy and consistent. And I've seen plenty of athletes been very successful with quite modest volume and frequency of running, even 3-4 times a week, 30 to 40K. I've still seen athletes been able to be very successful as long as they're able to be consistent and maintain health. Of course, some athletes who believe they're not durable, it's because they've been making training errors. And so, first look for the correctable errors, again, in terms of volume of intensity, frequency of intensive sessions. They'd gone 2 intensive sessions or less per week. Are there other changes they can make, which may actually not be related to functionally how durable they are, but instead are related to training errors. So that would be what I would look for in first. And when I'm in my coaching and my work around the world, I would see far more athletes who are having health problems, not because they have a fundamental biomechanical issue. It's because they're overtraining relative to the readiness of their body. So they've either not been patient to build up, they're trying to do too much too soon, and this is the reason for their problems, not necessarily that they have a fundamental problem with the way they're put together or the way that they move. All injuries are essentially overload injuries, aside from accidents, of course. And everyone has different limits. Some athletes, 70, 80K is near the limit. Some can be in over 100K and manage that. And of course, the principle coming again is more isn't always better. What's optimal depends on how we integrate swim, bike, run together. It depends on how and why, what we're trying to achieve, how we put together that program. So I've talked a lot about the minimal effective dose as a concept in various venues, and it's something that I think is relevant in this case as well. Next question is difference between intensity and volume for men and women. And my response to that is I wouldn't necessarily put it between men and women, but just what is their training history? What is their profile? How many years have they been training? How much? What do they show physiologically in terms of recovery? How do they respond individually when they're fatigued? What is their psychological characteristics when they're fatigued? So determining the optimal training load, I think, is more about individual than necessarily male or female. There's probably a greater difference between individuals than they are between genders in that case. So that'd be something to consider. There's some thought, historically, that if you have greater muscle mass and you're engaging in a lot of training like running, that you might need more recovery as a result. But I think in practice, we can just consider people as individuals and what's their history, what do we know about them, how do they respond, and look at treating them in that way. Next was metrics for recovery. And as I've said a lot in the past, although it's been some years for the podcast side, but I don't use formal metrics systematically for recovery. I think mood and self-reported fatigue is a very strong indicator of recovery. We know from a meta-analysis of all different metrics that mood is among the highest relevance, the athlete's mood, and it's not always easy to detect that, but we can, as coaches, grow those skills to detect mood and attitude in terms of readiness to train, and of course knowing the context. What did they do in training recently? What did we ask them to do? We can look at things like volume, intensity recently. You can look at things like chronic load, various metrics like that. But the primary one is simply asking the athletes, how do you feel? Do you have soreness? What was your energy like today? And I think it's very effective, and it's connected to communication, which is fundamental. So that's where what we're implementing systematically. The next question was around the success of my squad and my coaching. What about success breeds success? It's an interesting question. from the point when you have a dynamic, when you're getting when athletes in a group or an environment are being successful, how does that help others? And I mean, the first part that comes to mind about that is simply confirmation of what you're doing is working, if you like, or it's being effective. And of course, every athlete knows that everyone is different in terms of how they will respond to training. However, there's really can help confidence if your training mate that followed the same process that you're following, it goes out and has success. And we know that so much of racing performance, but also training effectiveness, comes down to your self-confidence, belief in what you're doing, belief in the relationships, and being able to communicate is all connected to confidence. So it's certainly an advantage, and it leads to more success. Of course, it's not always been that way. I've not always had situations where we've lined up a number of great performances in one group during a period of time. I've been on the other side as well, where we've gone to races and we've had no success with any of the athletes, and you know, there's that side of it as well, where we have to pay attention to that situation where if we don't lose confidence as a result of lose confidence in the process, or if the athletes don't start to ask questions about what we're doing without being able to answer why we weren't successful in that case. So I think the fundamental part about success breeding success is about confidence in your process. And you know, certainly when new athletes look to join our environment, you know, of course, they're able to look and have that social proof, if you like, of look, what we've done before, and we've been able to be successful. And if we can show that we've done that with many different types of athletes, different backgrounds, then they'll be more confident in that process, and the confidence perhaps is more robust. And I think that's one of the issues with new athletes, but in your coaching process, is that you know, at the beginning, that you're not guaranteed to get it right, or it may just take time. You know, an athlete that doesn't have the training history, that can't absorb the training in the same way, will need to do things a little differently, might have some modifications, and we need to build in time and confidence for patience. And I think certainly so many athletes are not patient in the process. They don't realize that achieving their potential takes years, and in fact, just changing the program in the short term, you know, going to a new coach or a new group, you know, we're not likely to see immediate success from getting the training right. We might have more success from doing a bit less, or there's some easy wins there in terms of getting the training load at a better rate. But in terms of making improvements beyond that, it takes time. And we've seen that can take multiple years of following a process to see the athlete really be able to fully absorb and take steps forward. And I think, you know, the more success you have in the meantime buys that time, buys that patience for some athletes that may not have that. So certainly it's a powerful part of our environment that we can point to the success we've had. And also, I suppose, as a coach, you know, I talk about this concept of building your experience, building your personal database of different experiences. And though no two experiences are often alike exactly, having had success in different contexts also gives confidence in that process, and increases the chance of getting the decision points right, moving forward into the future based on those different experiences. The next question is how we choose camp locations, and I've changed locations over the years based on the competition calendar, where we think is best, what makes sense for travel, and some of these things may be different in the future, at least in the current context and next year or two. but one of the advantages of the work with an independent squad that's not connected to one federation has been a great freedom to choose where you think is best and vary according to the year, the calendar, and what as opposed to a residential center where we live and train in one place. Of course, there are pros and cons to those approaches. But that's in part how. In general, if I look at what are the factors for any training location, I think, of course, pool access. It's less important whether it's 25 or 50 meters, but pool access according to the timing that we would like, that we need. Second is safe cycling of a variety of terrain. Safe meaning traffic-wise, primarily, but also your road surface. And of course, it's better if we have hills that we can use. If we have a perfect location, it would have hills and flats and circuits for technical training. So that's one factor. And then the running, it's how much off-road running do we have primarily, do we have hills, do we have a track? We've managed in plenty of places where we didn't have great track access, but certainly off-road running from the door, meaning like without having to drive very far. That would be the perfect location, particularly with high running frequency. Not have to get in the car every time is nice. How to manage plans of different athletes is the next question, and that's thinking about individualization, and that's certainly changed over time. That's evolved in how I think about it. The majority of the program, if the athletes are competing for the same goals, of course, the majority of the program is going to be based on the demands of the goals, demands of the competition. The demands are the demands. They don't change based on the individual athlete. But of course, the individual readiness to how to train for those demands can be different. Like we talked about the run volume, the training history of the athlete. And I think the primary factor is considering how do we keep them healthy and how do we manage the training load to keep healthy and consistent. And that's the origin of what the different plans for the different athletes. That's where it's going to come from, is what do we know about the athlete? What differences do we need to have so that they maintain their health? What's their optimal training load to avoid interruptions due to injury and ill health? So that's where that's coming from. And while the differences may be small, of course, those differences are important to get right. And that's, the fundamentals of keeping a squad successful and healthy and performing well is that each individual within that environment is able to do the work they need to do and be consistent and that they see improvement in their performance and in their training process. So there's important differences to get right. Next question is how to figure out the paces of run sessions. And it's as simple as going off of what do we know about their running history. I don't think we need running tests, but what is their current run fitness compared to past performances? And the model I used early in my career was based on Jack Daniels' book and based on the VDOT concept, so assigning a value to their personal best performances. And of course, we need to adjust based on current fitness, so that's different in the beginning of the season versus at peak fitness. And then assigning paces to different intensities that we want to manage. And so that's the origin of that, and now it's fairly easy to adjust that based on the small range that we actually find of training intensities. And I think it's critical to get right, because the biggest errors that we see are overestimating the speeds that the athletes need to run versus their actual conditioning and their actual history. So many athletes I see running too fast relative in training relative to their past performances, relative to their fitness, and they're most likely to have problems because of that. So how do I figure this out is, I think a good starting point is looking at like the VDOT concept based on peak performances they've had in the past and adapting it to the current reality as far as we see it. The next question is how to pick the level of races for each athlete, the race at the level you're at. I talk about this in the eBooks that I mentioned at the beginning, and how to build an elite athlete. That ebook, which will be in the show notes, and essentially we need some races that are above the current level, but not too many. It's the biggest mistake is choosing races that are above the level of performance that the athlete is actually at. Of course, the majority of races need to be appropriate for the level that they're at, and then it can be useful to have some races that are below the level where the athlete can have high success, so that they recall that they're actually a good athlete. And it can easily be something that gets lost when if the athlete only competes at races that are too high of a level. And certainly in the Olympic pathway, that's, we can break that down between domestic races, between international Grand Prix style races like the French Grand Prix, the Italian Grand Prix, the Bundesliga, or other domestic specific format races. Super League could be another level above that. And then we have European Cups, Continental Cups globally, World Cups and World Series. And then Grand Final Olympic Games as another step higher. And so, for young athletes, they might be, focused on domestic races, then Continental Cups and international races, but at a low enough level in order to master and move up step by step. So I talk about this process in the ebook, building the elite athlete, in a bit more detail. Next question is, how much talent is a factor in WTS? And of course, I mean, the question about talent comes up a lot. But I would turn the question in the sense of, what do we think the reasons why some athletes are more successful than others? And looking deeper at this question in all sport, but I can say in triathlon that there's a difference between talent to, for instance, compete in World Series, the top level of Olympic pathway triathlon. There's an entry point, and you have to have a minimum amount, but I wouldn't say that the physiological factors that we can measure are particularly differentiating between the athletes who are winning and the athletes who are 5th and 10th and 15th, and 20th. You wouldn't see necessarily a difference in ranking based on anything that you could measure like that. There's plenty of athletes who have incredible physical characteristics that aren't necessarily successful for a lot of reasons. So I'd always ask, well, what do we think are the differences? And we can talk about environment, development, opportunities at key moments in their age and their career. The decisions they make, the type of training that they do, history of injuries and ill health that can derail progression. All of these things come into play. You can't make somebody that doesn't have the required physiology into Olympic champion, but you're not going to determine the Olympic champion based on physiology alone. It's not enough. So I think those other factors are what we can control and where we have influence as coaches, and therefore we should focus on that. And I think certainly many coaches think about coaching, well, perhaps in the context, well, I haven't had the opportunity to work with the best talent, for example. But really, I think our job as coaches is to maximize the potential of the athletes we do have the opportunity to work with. That's what's in our control. And that's where we can make a difference. We can make an impact. We can add value. So although talent is important in our day-to-day job in coaching, it's not controllable, and it's not the differentiator. And I'll take an athlete with a good attitude and good decision making and perspective over one that's slightly more physiologically talented. I think in a sport like triathlon, which is so complex and multifactorial for success, that I'll take attitude and commitment over, if it was so black and white, over simply physiology. And those are the impact where we can make an impact, and we can make a difference as coaches. So we'll wrap it up there. I welcome questions, feedback, future things you'd like me to talk about or reflect on based on my experiences, what you'd like to hear from me. Contacting me direct, podcast@joefiliol.com by email, and have a look at the eBooks and presentations on joefiliol.com/shop, and let me know what you'd like to see there. Thanks for listening.